Greetings. Welcome to the Lovefly fearofflying Q&A. Sorry it's 4 minutes late, Geeta. I'm on time as much as I can be. Geeta said, I'll be watching live. Can you be on time? All right. I was going to be on time, but then I started going through all the questions, and my goodness, got 2 pages worth, which is fantastic news. And for me, maybe not for you. So settle in. Maybe got a packed lunch. Got a lot to go through today. Wow. So quick intros and stuff. We've had a lot of new people in the group. So as always, a huge welcome to all the new humans to the Lovefly community. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you're getting what you need so far from it. There's lots of resources available in here. But I just want to say thank you for joining, and also thank you for all of those of you that have been recommending, because we look to see where people come from. Quite often it can be recommended by somebody. Occasionally it'll be some random thing, but mostly it's recommended, and then the obviously the podcasts and things like that. So the things that are available to you in this group, before I get into that, so you've got lots of free resources. So this live Q&A happens every week, well, we try to anyway, roughly about the same time, Geeta. And what we try to do is to answer the questions that come up in the group. So this is a private group, so no, this, if the answers are safe, they will also put it on our Lovefly YouTube channel as well, so that people can also get help out there. But there's a lot of resources in this group. So all of these Q&As are saved in the section called media or guides, depending on how you access Facebook. So it depends on your, whether you're on the app or whether you're doing it on the web. You'll have a different thing, but all of it's in the media. We have various guides. Guide number 1 is the fearofflying Q&As, which we do every week, like I said, so you can see all the past ones as well. And I tried to put like a few options, like tonight, for example. I can't put all of these down as hints of what's going to be covered because there's so many questions, which is great, like I said. But you'll see all those. Also, there's a bunch of inspiring posts in there as well, and about 2 or 3 guides worth of those, loads and loads of wisdom, tips, and all sorts of stuff in there. So, there's just tons of free resources like that. The other thing that you will know as well, many of you will know, is that we do a podcast which is called originally Lovefly. Yeah, don't know how we came up with that. And that in that, which is on Spotify and Google and Amazon, all those normal places, we have guests on there who talk about their fear of flying and what they've done to help themselves. And also we have technical experts from all sorts of things. And it's getting broader and broader as well now, as Mr. Bond finds lots and lots of different people to come along and talk to us. Now, what I want to say is that I would say there's value in all those podcasts. So if you can bear it, go through them, binge them, because you get most of your answers there that you'll ever ask. And it starts right back 3 years ago now. I think we were up to episode 165 at the moment. And we were looking at the weekend. We always have a meeting at the weekend, the 3 of us, me, Susan, and John. And we talk about all the podcasts that have come up, what's been recorded. And I was just looking, crikey, we've got loads that are saved. We've got a bunch that are coming up as well, and lots of exciting ones. I'll give you a bit of a flavor of those in a minute. But there's tons and tons of stuff in there. And if you can't access them, because if you go onto like Spotify or somewhere like that, for example, you will find that you can't go back that far. So if you go onto Podbean, Podbean, then you can get all of them right back to number 1. Now, the earlier ones, I cringe, so I don't tend to listen back to them because it just makes me go, ooh. But there is literally some gold in every episode that someone has shared. And I think it's well worth checking these things out, okay? So that's the free stuff. There's, we also have blogs on our website, which is lovefly.co.uk, and you can ask questions on there as well. And as long as it's not like 15 pages worth, we'll do our best to answer them. Other places, we've got our Instagram, which is at Lovefly Help. That's Instagram at Lovefly Help. And the YouTube channel is Lovefly Team. And we would really like to build up the subscribers to that, please. So if you can, get over there, and you'll then be able to see a lot of the podcasts are also video versions as well. So if you want to watch the guests and hear what they've got to say, you can go on there and have a look. So to the questions. All right, let's cover the podcast this week. So this week we've got Jenny Matthews. Now let me just bring up some information about Jenny. So Jenny is a licensed mental health therapist and former fearful flyer, and the owner of State of Mind Therapy. And she's dedicated to supporting individuals facing anxiety disorders and OCD. And so she's based over in, I don't remember now where she is, in Minnesota. Okay, so she and her husband, Justin, a former aviator, teamed up to lead fear-flying courses in Minnesota here to help people gain confidence to fly. And so she brings together things like science-backed strategies with a warm, flexible touch and approach. Okay, so I would definitely go and look at that. And we'll talk about that on Wednesday when the podcast comes out. So that's Jenny. She's out this week. So, bunch of questions. So thank you very much for asking these. There's loads. My goodness. Right, let's get going. So Mez says, exposure therapy, is it helpful or triggering? And I would say, without being cheesy, it's both helpful and triggering. So definitely, I would say all therapy is exposure therapy, because eventually you have to go and expose yourself to the thing, don't you? The thing that you perceive to be a threat. So in this case, it's fear of flying. So all of it has an element of that, because regardless of what route you go to, whether you listen to the podcast, whether you come and do some of our paid courses like the 30-day program, or our face-to-face like the one in Manchester in April, or the webinars, or whatever else that you do, eventually you've got to go and face the thing. So I think all of it is exposure, but there's lots of other things you can do as well. So for example, going to the airport, I think that's really good. It might trigger you. It will not set you back, to your question. The point is, these are all things that are going to happen when you fly. So the more you can go towards these things, the better. And that's the same with all of these things. Essentially, you've got to go towards it. So exposing yourself to the threat is absolutely crucial, but you can do it at the pace that you want to do it in, like little steps. So going to the airport, if that's a bit too much for you, you could then watch videos. So one of the suggestions that Melissa suggested, which is really good, is Big Jet TV. Hopefully we'll get them on the podcast at some time. But we do have Evie Aviation coming on in a few weeks' time, and she's been doing lots of videos of takeoffs and stuff. So you may have seen some of the stuff in the Facebook group occasionally, but she's going to come and talk. So I think things like that are really, really helpful. Noel Phillips is another one to watch, because he films himself, and he's been on the podcast as well. And he does this stuff where he literally just will get on any flight. He doesn't care where it's going, what the airline is. Sometimes he doesn't even want to know who it is. He just gets on it and then he films what it's like. And that's really great, because he's so approachable, and he just normalizes the whole experience, So definitely do that. So Nikki's asked a question about decompression. Okay, so why it happens and how often. So the first thing you get this idea is like, oh my goodness, this is something that's going on all the time, but it's not. So why is it? What is decompression? So I'm going to refer to my friend David Gott, who used to talk about this a lot when we ran our Flying Without Fear courses, the Virgin version before, when we had flights and stuff. And David always used to talk about, there's two types, and you've got slow and you've got rapid. And there's probably different ways that different airlines talk about this when it comes to safety training, but essentially this is it. So what is it? So you're walking about at whatever altitude you're at right now, which is ground level, and you're breathing normal oxygen, and then you take a flight, and then you realize that you leap 5 miles into the air, and this is not a natural environment for you to be at. Okay, so when you're doing that, you have to have assistance to be able to breathe normally. And what happens is the cabin, if you imagine like it's solid, this thing, it's then packed full of air, because the outside conditions are not sustainable for human life for very long. So if you're flying at 5 miles and you were just you are breathing the oxygen up there, it's a lot thinner, which enables us to fly faster and less fuel costs, etc. However, for humans, that's not very sustainable. So the aircraft is artificially pressured to make it around somewhere, depending on what aircraft type, somewhere between like 6,000 to 8,000 feet, which is very comfortable for humans to breathe at. So it's got more air in it inside than it has outside. So they, you know, imagine how strong these aircraft parts are to hold this extra air, if you like. So what happens with the decompression is that, you know, the most likely one, I almost said common then, but they're not common, but the most likely one would be a slow one, which so there's a slight leak somewhere. And I know some of you would think, oh my goodness, it's just full of holes. Well, yeah, it is full of holes, but it's very carefully controlled. So imagine a small leak, and then the pressure slowly drops. Now there are meters, there's ways of knowing this. As soon as it gets below a certain altitude, so for example, if it suggests, oh, actually now it's getting, we need to do something about this, the mast would drop automatically, and then the pilots would be thinking, okay, let's get down to a breathable altitude, and they can do this pretty rapidly. Okay, so you can get down to that sort of altitude, which will be about between 12 and 14,000 feet, because you want to get to a place where we can breathe normally. Okay, and then so even if we are losing pressure, that is what we would do. Now, if it was a rapid decompression, which is the other type, this would be more of a substantial hole, for want of a word. And again, these things are exceptionally rare. But unfortunately, the media, being what it is, will just report these things as if they're going on all the time. But that's essentially what they are. Now, the thing is, they don't happen very often. When they do, they're going to make the media. We've got procedures in place. We're all trained to deal with this. The aircraft have got more oxygen on those masks than you ever would need. There's spare masks, and the pilots would descend the aircraft quicker than you can imagine. You don't really feel it. You always think you do. So even if you're looking at the altimeter and it's dropping down, you think, oh my goodness, but it actually doesn't feel like it looks. So some people have filmed this. Look, we're literally dropping out the sky, and it's all what I would call crap. So unfortunately, because it gets put into the media and people don't know what they're looking at, because, you know, you're not trained pilots or you're not trained in commercial aviation, it can look a lot worse than it is. But the reality is it's a very controlled procedure. The pilots will always think safety. Bear in mind, they're in it with us, so they're not going to think, oh, what should we do about this? Everything that's happened like that, it's been practiced time and time again. And every 6 months, when they go into the simulator, 2 lots of 4-hour sessions, this is one of the things that they have to do every single time. They always have a decompression amongst all the other hundreds of things that we could possibly think of that could go wrong. These are things that they have to practice and pass every 6 months. And I always think, imagine that for those of us who are drivers that are watching this today, if we had to be retested on our driving abilities every 6 months, how much safer would the roads be? You know, there you go. So Anita's asked questions about mistakes at runway, things like the times that they've been calculated, because of reports of airplanes being near to each other, seconds from crashing, etc. Unfortunately, there's a lot of media stuff around this. There were some incidents at some US airports, maybe last year perhaps, and this did make the media, quite rightly. You know, there's nothing hidden in commercial aviation, so there were some things that happened. There are many systems in place to prevent this. For example, you haven't just got the air traffic. You've also got the radar systems. You've also got the pilots are looking around. They're using their own eyeballs. They've got a situationally aware. There's set gaps between when you come into land and when you can take off. And if there's an aircraft at the end of a runway and it hasn't quite cleared, and I mean like it's literally just turning, but it's still technically on the end of that runway, and there's an aircraft coming into land, they will perform a go around. That will be classed by the media as a near miss. So this is the thing. So it's in the interest of being transparent with you. Anything that happens like that is reported, and it can seem like, oh my goodness, this is stuff going on all the time. Unfortunately, there were some other things around talking about air traffic control, and there's some questions around that, and anything like this is investigated. So unfortunately, it just gets reported in a way which is not helpful when you're looking at it thinking, oh my goodness. Now, so the thing that Anita also asked about calculated times, and I was thinking maybe you were thinking about like takeoffs and that as well. Now, it isn't just like one person doing this, so it's worked out in several ways, and there's lots of cross-checking that goes on. So computers work it out, but also humans are involved in it. So nothing happens there's no single point of failure, is I guess the point I want to make about commercial aviation. No single point of failure, which is a thing which is a very interesting idea, but it's true. So there's always a backup to a backup, and there's always a procedure. So when something does go wrong, which is exceptionally rare, it's always like, oh, what the hell happened there? Because there's normally like 6 or 7 factors that had any one of those at one point been picked up, then whatever it was that happened. I'm not talking about fatal things. I'm talking about just like incidents. Because of the way that commercial aviation is, and we want to keep it safe because we love it. Everything is looked into. There's so many people, and it's been fascinating with me meeting so many on the podcast, that all these different professionals that are working in the background, just thinking about safety all the time. You'd be amazed. So one of those is coming up actually. I'll mention that in a minute. Okay, so hopefully that one helps, Anita. Maria, stalling when turning in takeoff and how to feel safe when my body is triggered. Okay, so stalling is not the same as, just to stay in my lane. I'm not a pilot, so when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it from the experience of having listened to the pilots talk about this on the fearofflying courses that I've run since 1996, 97. Okay, so you think in that time, I've probably seen around 30,000 people go through courses because we were running about 20 a year. So there's a lot of people, a lot of people been through. So, and I've seen a lot of pilots talk about this. But one of the things that I know about this is that stalling is not the way that we talk about it. So when you think about stalling, you think about your engines, don't you? But that's not what we mean in aviation. Stalling means when you lose lift over the wing. But because you've got forward motion and you've got the wings configured correctly and everything's been thought about in terms of the right height, the right weight, the right power, everything, I can't think how you would stall. So the stall means when the lift is lost over the wing, not like the engines. So when you're up there and you take off, you've got the right amount of lift, you've got the right amount of power, and you've got extra power that you don't use. So it's been worked out. What's our redundancy? In other words, what's our extra capacity? So even if an engine fails, which I know a lot of people worry about, you've still got enough power to be able to take off. Okay, so these are things which are just, it's like, oh, I didn't realize that. This is all stuff that we talk about on our courses, of course, in much more detail. But you're taking off, you've got everything that you've worked out already what you're going to do, then you turn, all the forces of physics are still working. So even as you turn, you don't actually turn, although it might feel like you're doing this, you're actually only turning about 30 degrees. And when you're taking off, you're taking off about 15 degrees. And then after 1,500 feet, roughly, at every airport across the world, that drops from 15 degrees down to about 10 or 11 degrees. And the engines get a bit quieter, and it feels like a lot of things are going on, which suggests that the aircraft is falling, but it's not. It's still climbing. You just can't feel it because we're not birds, and we're not calibrated to feel this very subtle movement. But the pilots up the front can see exactly what's going on. Okay, so I hope that helps. Now, the thing in terms of what can I do when I feel my body is triggered, your body may be triggered currently, but it's a case of everything is linked. So one of the things we talk about in the audio book, which is episode 69 on the podcast, by the way, is the fact that everything's linked. So if you start working in one area, you're going to start to feel differently with others. So all I'd say is keep asking these questions and cognitively challenge, what am I doing here? What am I saying to myself? Is that true? Because as you start to accept a different reality, then you will start to feel slightly different as well. And the fact that you feel something doesn't make it true. So some people will say, oh, I feel like it was sinking. I feel like we were falling. I felt like we were leaning over. But these are all feelings, but you're not calibrated for this sort of thing. You don't have complicated aircraft instruments and you're not a bird. So you're basically a flawed human, as am I. So whatever you're feeling is your perception, and you over-exaggerate when you're a nervous flyer. So it's not the truth. It's your brain in your body telling you crap. That's a technical term. Okay, so Laura says, I'm using the podcast and I'm also on the Manchester course, but there's lots of things I'm worried about. Can you go through? Can you give me a big list? Thanks a lot, Laura. Right, blowouts, metal fatigue, rudders, anything to do with fires, charges, anything that make, oh yeah, okay, so nice, and anticipatory anxiety. Whoa, okay, so blowouts, I think you mean tires. Okay, so you've got more tires than you need and they're just a tire. All right, so not a problem. Metal fatigue, this is already thought about. So if you imagine the aircraft has a very strict maintenance schedule. So for example, you can have there's no limit to an age of an aircraft flying. It's just the checks become more and more rigorous, and that's what makes it too expensive to keep it going. But if you start with an aircraft, if you imagine like it starts at 40 million pounds, it's already well made, isn't it? And they already know when they make it that we say, well, okay, we know that the undercarriage widget, this particular thing, this component, after so many rotations, up and down, how many times it goes, we know that after 200,000 of these, it's going to start to wear. We will change it at 100,000. So it's already like half of what it's changed well before it's actually needed to be changed. And that is the way that everything is approached. And when every few years, the aircraft is literally stripped back to its frame and they go around and inspect it in minute detail to look for things like fatigue. So this is all stuff that we've learned over the last 50 or 60 years, because back in the 50s and the 60s, this was stuff that wasn't really known. And it was only those accidents that happened then have helped us to learn the lessons for now. Okay. So things like the rudder, there's, everything that's on an aircraft, because it can be very easy to sort of zoom in on one thing, which I think you might be doing here, is to think, well, what about this and what about this? And one of the things I've known about nervous flyers is that there is no limit to the number of questions that you can ask, because for every question that's answered, you'll say, yeah, but what about this and what about that? So we have to sort of like chunk it up a bit and go, fundamentally, what is my belief about commercial aviation and safety? And this is the place that I want you to get to. It's like saying, okay, there's no single point of failure. Anything that can happen gets looked into and we make sure it doesn't happen again. It's so safe for us now because of things that have happened in the past that we've learned from. Okay, and we always learn from them. And so that gives us that reassurance. So whether you're asking about chargers, phone chargers and fires and stuff, there's so many auto fire extinguishers. There's so many things that happen in security in terms of the scanning that goes on for all the different electrical equipment. There's so much training, knowledge, information, investigations, etc., that goes into every single aspect. Anything that goes anywhere near an aircraft has been thought about, planned, and it's probably been rejected several times over before it's been accepted. So I know it's easy to sort of think about these things, but even if the worst case scenario happened and there was a fire, the cabin crew are trained not to do with that. And so there's just so many things in place. Now, in terms of anticipatory anxiety, it sounds a bit sort of glib to say this, but all anxiety is anticipatory, because if it was happening to you, then you're just having fear. So anxiety is always in the future. So one of the phrases that Martin and Sally talk about, the authors of that anticipatory anxiety book that a lot of you have recommended, which they've been on the podcast, by the way. I can't remember when they're coming up, maybe 2 or 3 weeks time. They're a guest on our podcast. They'd be talking about that, but they always talk about that anxiety is in the future, but it bites in the present. That's one of the little phrases they talked about, which I really loved, but more about that later. But yeah, so all of these things can be got round. So the thing for you, Laura, is just to start notice because it's a bit like the onion analogy, you know, like as you sort of peel back each layer, there's another layer underneath, and eventually there's no onion. And that is what it's like with the fear of flying question. So it's okay to satisfy the logical part of your brain and think, but what about this and what about this? But there will come a point where we have to go, okay, what is my fundamental belief about flying? Am I prepared to take a few things on faith that these people are professional, trained, regulated, tested, and there's backups for backups, and there's no single point of failure? So at some point, when eventually you can accept that idea, you'll start to notice a difference in the way that you feel about commercial flying. So Barney's asked a question around turnarounds. Time's been really quick. Now, Barney, if you search Emma Henderson in our Facebook group, the Lovefly Facebook group, you'll see that she's posted about this because she used to work for a no-frills airline which does those quick turnarounds, and she talks about the fact, you know, how much is in place in terms of regulations, etc., etc. Also, we had the jet mechanic on, Stephen Potter, who does a lot on Instagram. He came and talked on our podcast as well. He's coming up he's in a few weeks' time, that one, and he talks about he's serviced those quicker turnaround aircraft as well. And just like there's still things that you have to do between each time that you take off and land. Is that right? Between each time you land and take off, not taking that. Anyway, you know what I mean. Okay, so Jenny, you've asked a question about this is there's a trigger warning with this, so I'll share your trigger warning. So she said, you talk about, planes won't drop out the sky, etc., etc. However, there was a flight back in 2000 when this such and such happened. Could this happen again? So on the really, really rare occasion, something dramatic happens like that, which is terribly sad. And, I don't know which incident you're talking about, and I'm not going to go back into that because I don't want to remind people to start Googling these things. But on the rare occasion something happens, whilst it's very, very sad, we always learn from it. And with the goal being for nothing to repeat. Now, is it possible for something dramatic to happen again? Yes, of course it is. I'd be a liar if I said that nothing could ever happen. However, it's got to the point now with the safety margins are so amazing that it's exceptionally rare that anything's going to happen. It's almost to the point where people are now talking about it is there's pretty much zero risk to you when you fly because of so much has been put in place and so much has learned, so many backups, etc., like I've said before, that it's got to the point now where you're thinking, okay, it's exceptionally unlikely. In fact, one of the phrases I say in the audiobook is that if you want to live longer, you should fly more because the risk is managed, but the rest of your life it isn't, but you just don't notice. So flying has well managed, and I'm talking about Western commercial aviation, okay? The risk is well managed. And it's not that it's zero, but it's not far off zero. So yeah, I would say that please, I know I can see that you stopped looking at those air crash investigation programs. So I'm delighted to read that because unfortunately they don't particularly help. If you're not scared of flying, they're quite interesting because they're so rare when you sort of see what's happened. But unfortunately, the way they do these things, sometimes because they've got the dramatic music and the way that they portray these things and they give you these visual images, I don't think it's helpful unless you're completely over your fear of flying. And then you can be quite curious about it, So I look at these things and I think, well, that's interesting. That's what happened there. I don't dwell on it because I don't think my fundamental belief is that commercial aviation is flying. So I've met so many people, so many professionals, and I know so many people now and work with them now, and to see their sort of dedication, what they have to go through to get to that place. We're not just talking, like doing flying as a pilot for a bit of a laugh. There's just too much involved to get to that stage, and there's just so much in place to even just keep your license. To even get to a point of being a commercial pilot, there's so many things to do. And And I don't know why anyone would do it. You've got to love it. It's got to be an absolute passion, because I don't know. It's not an easy job to do. It can be quite tiring. There's a lot of checking. There's a lot of being tested and inspected and stuff. So you'd have to love it to do it, because it's not one of those jobs that you can just, go think, oh, I might do this for a bit of a laugh. You've got to be really serious and committed. And that's the same for everybody I come across in commercial aviation. I was talking to one of the pilots recently, actually, on one of the podcasts, Rosie Scott, and she's going to be on later as well. And she was talking about that she sort of takes it for granted that because in her line of work, if someone says something to her and she says, I don't understand what you just said, no one goes, oh my goodness, you don't understand. Oh my God, because it's one of those industries where you just say, I don't know. And you can say to the most senior pilot next to you, I don't understand. Can you repeat what you just said? I don't understand it. You can challenge each other. It's that sort of environment. She said it's so normal for her where she's working that when she goes and then talks to people in other jobs and then says, I don't understand what you said, they look at her like she's stupid. And she sort of forgets that in commercial aviation that doesn't happen, because it's a no blame culture. It's like, we're all here for the safety. We're all here to do a good job and get home safe back to our families. Why would we mess around, and why would we ridicule each other because somebody doesn't know something? If someone needs to know something, you just ask, you get it answered. It's just factually given. There's no sort of edge to it. And it just makes me realize that what a sort of privilege it is to be in this world that we're in of commercial aviation. So Chris, hello again, Chris. You've asked about turbulence. How do you keep everything secure? Baggage, engines, pumps, things, basically all the things that we cannot see. Oh my goodness, all the things you cannot see. Well, that's very nice and specific there. Okay, so the baggage is secured. I'm not sure if we have had someone on from aircraft. We will get somebody on. All right, baggage handler. We'll talk about that. But it's all secured. It's all planned where it is put. Okay. Turbulence doesn't shake it that much. I know you think it does, but it doesn't. So lots of things that rattle on board the aircraft, they're supposed to do that. That's that flexibility. Things are meant to be a bit loose. That's all good. Everything else has been tested. So everything that's meant to move moves, and the things that aren't meant to move, they don't move. But they don't move that much anyway. Just we perceive that they do. So we always think that turbulence is like shaking the aircraft apart, but it's not. That's just our perception of it. To the aircraft, it's infinitely stronger than anything that turbulence is going to throw at it. But when we're in it, we always think that that gosh, goodness me, it's just a matter of time. But it's not moving anywhere near as much as we think it is, and so we're not. So with our perception of what is it, I hope everything's tied down properly. Well, of course it is, but also it's not moving as much as we think it is anyway. Hopefully that answer. That was a bit of a sort of a glib, quick answer, but I hope that was okay, Chris. And the reason I say that is because you've been on a podcast, and I know you're pretty much on your way out of the fear of flying. So the last question I've got for now, and then I'll check the Facebook in a moment just to see if there's anything else that's come through. The safety standard, this is from Rachel. Safety standards between US, European, different airlines, and there's a general question, right? Long haul flights, short flights. How's this all work? So there are governing bodies that regulate airspace. So in the US, it's the FAA, for example. So in the UK, it's the CAA, for these aviation authorities that regulate the airspace. So they have international standards that we all abide by. Then there are country standards. Now, all of these standards are super, super high. So anything that flies in your airspace has to meet the same standards as everybody else. And if it doesn't, it isn't allowed to. It doesn't mean it's unsafe. It's just it's not meeting the standard of the country that it's flying into, or the airspace it's flying into. And so this idea around sort of safety is of paramount importance, and standards. There's no point sort of like fudging these. You need to have a consistent standard, but you can't have 100% consistent. So we've got a really high international standards, and this is commercial aviation. I'm not talking about private pilots and all that sort of stuff. I'm talking about Western world commercial aviation. So anywhere that you fly that's in the developed world, you're going to be meeting similar standards. Now, local procedures might be slightly different and it might be a bit unfamiliar because they'll do things slightly different, but broadly speaking, you're going to be meeting the same standards. And anywhere that's in a developed world, commercial aviation, get on. And if you want any reassurance around that, go watch the Noel Phillips ones, because he gets on some things that just look like flying tractors, basically, and I wouldn't get on it. But he's not bothered. He jumps on it, goes, "Oh, this is a bit of a laugh," because he has this faith that's well proven and well tested for him. It's like, it's flying, it's safe, I'm not bothered about it. But I probably wouldn't take my family on some of the things that he goes on because I want to be comfortable. But in terms of safety, right, let me just have a quick look on the Facebook, see if there's anything on there that's come up. Right. Da, 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 da. Hi Gordon, hi Geeta, hi Christine, it's nice. Yes, hello Nikki, yeah, you're welcome. And anything else? No, I can't see any other questions. So obviously, if you do have any more, please post them later so that we can get them. We'll try to get them when we can during the Facebook Live itself. But I think I've answered the bulk of those. So thanks a million. Thank you so much for doing this, because otherwise I'd just be talking myself. And I feel like I'm talking to some humans that have asked these questions. I'm hoping the answers are satisfactory. Like I say, there's lots of ways that you can get these answers. You'll get more information, such as the podcast and stuff, and also you've got some resources that if you want to get that little bit of extra help. So you've got our instant downloadable webinar, which is available on lovefly.co.uk. You've got our live course, which has only got a few places left now in Manchester on the 13th of April. We will have other dates later in the year, and also hopefully another location and other ways that we're going to be looking to help people. So we have got a whole bunch of podcasts coming up. I was just thinking about, I'll just give you a flavour of some of them. So we've got Jenny Matthews this week. I've already mentioned this. And then we got another story by Kristen Colton. That's coming up. We've got the Red Eye podcast, which I'll tell you about that. It's just before March. That's going to be fun. That's somebody else that's launching a podcast. Two ex-cabin crew. One is serving, one's ex. That's really nice. Got Judith. She's talking about fearofflying courses that they run over in Hungary, and she's got some great advice as a serving cabin crew member. We've got Jerry Cordero, who's going to be telling his story, what he's learned from facing his own fear of flying. He's in the Lovefly Facebook group quite a lot. You've got Martin and Sally, the authors of the Anticipatory Anxiety books, Overcoming. So they're talking to us. We've got Deb Laurie, who was the first Australian female pilot, and she's got a bridge flyover named after her in Australia. So that was really cool. She's still flying now. She's amazing. Yeah, absolutely amazing. She was. We've got Anthony from Nav Canada. We're going to be talking about quite a lot of stuff, which I can't remember what that was about now, but it's a few weeks out. I'll remind myself nearer the time. I've got Wes Patel, part 2. So Wes was on our podcast a little while ago before his big flight, and then this is him telling his story with his wife as well, which is lovely because they're talking about it from her perspective and his perspective. That's a really nice one. We've got the jet engineer, which is Stephen Potter. He's going to be talking about what the sort of stuff he has to go through in his training. So I think he's called a jet mechanic. I think that's his thing on Lovefly. We've also got a few others that are saved. We've got Danny Spooner, who's great story. She tells her personal history of flying and what she's done to overcome it. She's not perfect, but still feels like she's made some progress and chipping away at it. We've got Rosie Scott, who is one of the pilots who I mentioned earlier on, and she's talking about the training and lots of other really nice guest, like a great story. Then we've got Erica Rachel, who was member 4000 in the Lovefly Facebook group, and she's talking about flying as a visually impaired person, what that's like, which also prompted Pete Higgins, who who does the flight checklist, which is one of the free resources that he kindly donated, and it's in the files section of the Lovefly Facebook group. But it prompted us to think about an audio version of that, and so he's kindly putting a lot of time into being to recording an audio version of the checklist, which should be very good for the visually impaired, but also be good for anybody else who just wants to listen to it as they're flying on their flights. And the last one that's recorded is Nick Eads, who's the longest serving 747 captain. So he flew the 747 for 34 years, which apparently is the longest of anyone. And obviously no one's going to beat that, because that aircraft doesn't fly anymore. Well, I suppose cargo might count, but yeah. So and in the we've got a few others that are in the can, but until in the process of being booked in, but until they come off, I'm not going to mention those in case they don't happen. Then I'm like an idiot. Well, more of an idiot. So thank you very much for tuning in. Hope that was useful. I can't believe it's been nearly 45 minutes. Oh my goodness, if you're still here and alive, well done. Thank you for persevering. Like I said, podcast out this week with Jenny Matthews. Really nice interview, some tips as well. And also for those who want some help in the Minnesota area. So she's, her and her partner do that. So until next time, keep safe by flying more. And I look forward to seeing you next week and on the podcast Wednesday as well. Cheers.